We'll change themes now and talk about racism towards persons perceived to be from an Asian background during COVID-19 and some anti-racism approaches or steps that can be made to help combat racism towards persons who are Asian or even just persons who are perceived to be Asian. And I'll kind of explain why I'm making that distinction here. I'll present some research that has shown that Chinese persons have experienced a lot of anti-Asian racism in the past as part of the COVID-19 pandemic, but that this history of anti-Asian racism is not new. It has existed for a long period of time in Canada, especially during the building of the Canadian Railway. Chinese immigrants were treated extremely poorly. They were given the most dangerous jobs. They were forced to pay for their own tools. It was extreme abuse. There was extremely poor working conditions, and those conditions were the worst for persons who were Chinese immigrants. Right here in Vancouver, if you are commuting through Hastings Street, you probably pass by the PNE on the way to SFU. And the PNE actually has somewhat of a dark past because it was at one point in time used as the site of an internment camp during anti-Japanese sentiments during World War. And so internment camps were created specifically because of suspicions about, I won't just say Japanese persons, but all persons of an Eastern Asian background. When I introduced this topic, I mentioned in our society, there's a tendency to homogenize Asian cultures and refer to a widely different groups of people as under the umbrella term of Asian. So that's another sort of example of racism. It's not like a really direct or outward form of racism. There's certainly more harmful forms of racism. But as we'll see and kind of begin to learn, these sort of daily forms of racism can be especially harmful to people in terms of their health, in terms of their ability to sleep at the right times, to be able to be free of stress during their day. Hypersexualization of Asian women has been an ongoing concern as well, especially what we saw during the mass shootings in Georgia of women working at massage parlors. And then also stereotypes of Chinese persons and other persons from Eastern Asia as the model minority. Especially in the United States, persons will point to the low rates of criminal behavior among Asian Americans and then simultaneously blame Asian persons for the COVID-19 pandemic and essentially point to Asian persons as a threat to American values. And I believe that also obviously occurs here in Canada as well. And we've seen a lot of videos of it. We've seen men and women assaulted in the downtown east side for their Asian heritage. It's not something that's just confined to the United States. During the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian racism really increased. It escalated during the pandemic. Nearly 2,000 anti-Asian hate crimes were reported over about an 8-week period, March through June of 2020, down in the United States. About 30% of Asian Americans reported more frequent and more serious racial discrimination during the pandemic than before the pandemic. And about 40% of Asian Americans experienced COVID-related discrimination during just a 1-week period. So this could be things like not wanting that person to enter a grocery store or a restaurant, cafe solely because of the fact that they were perceived to be Chinese. Some of the common examples of anti-Asian discrimination during the COVID-19 pandemic include verbal harassment and assaults, racial slurs, shaming. We've seen violations of civil rights and discrimination there in the workplace, denial of services from establishments, cyberbullying as another form of racism that I think is maybe going to be even more prominent because of the proliferation of Facebook groups and on Instagram, everything like that. And young persons are more likely to experience this form of discrimination. Anti-Asian racism during COVID-19 has been characterized by a lot of hypocrisy as well. At the beginning of the pandemic, Asian perceived persons were perceived as wearing masks more frequently and therefore were more likely to be labeled as persons who were at a heightened risk of carrying COVID-19, when in reality such persons were being more careful about actually avoiding being sort of diagnosed or catching COVID-19. And then once it was recognized by local governments that wearing a mask was actually important, Asian perceived persons were accused of hoarding masks or accused of sending masks back to China. In the United States, and I believe that this is probably true in Canada as well, it's just we don't have the data to support any of these conclusions, but in the United States, anti-Asian hate crimes increased by about 150%, while overall hate crimes in the United States dropped 7% compared to back in 2019. So hate crime was on the decline, yet anti-Asian hate crime was dramatically on the rise. And it's important not to forget that anti-Asian hate crime existed before the pandemic as well. It's not as if the pandemic will disappear and then anti-Asian racism will also disappear. Young persons especially are over accounted for in instances of anti-Asian hate crime. And this is really consequential because one of the outcomes of the experience of racism is long-term damage to health and well-being. And for young persons who are developing, their health and well-being can be especially detrimental on future mental health, future physical health. And so the costs or the consequences are especially dire for young persons. I mentioned health effects, and here are some of the ones that Chinese persons and other Asian persons have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So depression and anxiety, sleep problems, and physical complaints. And this is also not unique to COVID-19 and not unique to anti-Asian racism. Black persons as well have reported experiencing exhaustion from the physical effects of racism in the wake of George Floyd's murder, for example. And that racism extends far beyond police brutality, and it sort of seeps into like everyday social structures, and that's why it can be particularly damaging, because it's this one lingering thing that people have to live with every single day.